It's January 3rd, 1945. The snow is falling heavy across the eastern hills of Poland, and Maria Kowalski, 24 years old, stands frozen at her doorstep. Not from the cold, though it bites through her wool shawl, but from the sight before her. A figure lies crumpled in the narrow alley beside her family's half-destroyed barn. His uniform is torn, caked in mud and blood. German. The eagle and swastika still visible beneath the filth. His breathing is shallow, ragged. Steam rises from his wounds into the frozen air. She knows what this means. Harboring an enemy soldier is death. For her. For her infant daughter sleeping inside. For anyone who knew and stayed silent. The Polish resistance patrols this village. Soviet scouts pass through daily. And yet her hands are already moving, already reaching for him, already defying every instinct of survival, because Maria Kowalski is not a soldier. She has no rank, no weapon, no protection. She is a mother, a widow, a woman with calloused hands who once baked bread for the neighbors and sang lullabies in the candlelight, and she is about to do something unthinkable. If stories like this move you as deeply as they move me, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These forgotten stories deserve to live again, and your voice helps make that happen. Maria was not born for war. She was born into quiet fields and Sunday prayers. Her father farmed wheat. Her mother embroidered linens for weddings. Maria grew up knowing the rhythm of seasons, the weight of flour sacks, the sound of church bells over the valley. At 19, she married Tomasz, a kind man who worked the mill and dreamed of opening a small carpentry shop. They had one daughter, Zofia, born in the spring of 1943. Life was modest, but it was theirs. Maria loved the smell of fresh bread. She loved the way her daughter's tiny fingers curled around her thumb. She loved the ordinary sacred monotony of days that stretched into years. Then the war came closer, first as distant rumors, then as the roar of artillery, then as smoke rising from the neighboring town. Tomasz was conscripted in the summer of 1944. He kissed Zofia's forehead, promised he would return, and disappeared into a column of men marching west. Maria never saw him again. No letter, no confirmation, just the silence that swallows men in war. By winter, her village was a graveyard of stone and ash. Houses stood half-collapsed. The church bell hung silent, cracked by shrapnel. Soviet forces pushed through in waves. Germans retreated in panic, and between them ordinary people, women, children, the elderly, tried to survive each day without being noticed. Maria lived with fear. Fear of scouts, fear of hunger, fear of the sound of boots. She hid food beneath the floorboards, covered the windows with dark rags, prayed quietly that Zofia wouldn't cry at night. Every knock on the door could be the last. Every shadow on the road could bring violence. She didn't have the luxury of sides. She had only her daughter's life to protect. And then, on that January morning, the war literally collapsed at her door. The German soldier didn't ask to be there. He didn't choose to fall in her yard. He was fleeing, wounded, lost from his unit during a bombardment near Krakow. He'd walked for 2 days through frozen fields, avoiding patrols, bleeding through his torn jacket. When he reached Maria's village, his body simply gave out. He collapsed in the snow, unable to take another step. And that's where she found him. Maria didn't move at first. She stood still, staring down. Her thoughts raced. If someone saw him, if the neighbors looked through their windows, if the resistance came, if the Soviets arrived, she could just close the door, pretend she didn't see him. Let him die there, quietly, outside her responsibility. It would be easier, safer, wiser. But then he moaned, a low, broken, human sound, and something inside her broke. She dragged him inside. It wasn't an act of ideology. It wasn't a political statement. It was instinct. The same instinct that made her wake in the middle of the night to feed Zofia. The same instinct that made her cover a stranger with a blanket when the temperature dropped. She saw him not as a German soldier, but as someone who was dying, and she couldn't let him die. But surviving the decision was another thing. Maria hid him in the small attic above the kitchen. Her cramped space, barely tall enough to sit in. She cleaned his wounds with boiled water and torn rags. He'd been shot twice, once in the shoulder, once in the thigh. The bullets had passed through, but the wounds were infected. He was feverish, delirious. He muttered in German words she didn't understand. She gave him what little she had: water, a thin bowl of soup, a threadbare blanket. He remained unconscious for 2 days, and then the trouble began. On the 3rd day, a Soviet officer knocked on Maria's door. He was looking for German deserters. There were reports that someone had been seen near the village. He entered without asking permission, looking around with sharp eyes. Maria stood with Zofia in her arms, her heart pounding so loud she was certain he could hear it. The officer checked the kitchen, the bedroom, the cellar. He paused beneath the attic hatch. Maria held her breath. "Who lives here?" he asked. "Just me and my daughter," she said, keeping her voice steady. "No men?" "My husband died in the war." He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded and left. That night, when the German soldier regained consciousness, Maria made a decision. She couldn't hide him forever. Sooner or later, someone would look more closely. She needed a story, something believable, something that would protect him. So she told him, "From now on, you're my brother." He looked at her, confused, still too weak to argue. She explained in slow Polish, gesturing, hoping he would understand. He spoke a little Polish, enough to comprehend. His name was Ernst. He was 22. He was from a small town near Munich. He didn't want to be in the war, he just wanted to go home. "If anyone asks," Maria said, "you're Piotr, my younger brother. You were injured working in the fields. You don't talk much because of trauma. You stay indoors, you don't go anywhere." It was an absurd lie, but it was all she had. For the next few weeks, Maria lived in silent terror. She improvised civilian clothes for Ernst from Tomasz's old things. She cut his hair. She taught him to keep his head down when he heard voices outside. She fed him from her own rations, letting herself go hungry. Zofia, too young to understand, smiled at the stranger in the attic, like he'd always been part of the family. Ernst recovered slowly. His fever broke. His wounds began to heal. He spoke little, but his eyes said everything. Shame, gratitude, fear. He knew she was risking her life. He knew he didn't deserve this. "Why are you doing this?" he asked one evening in broken German. Maria didn't answer immediately. She was mending a shirt by candlelight, Zofia asleep in a corner. Finally, she said, "Because you're someone, not a soldier, not an enemy, someone." But the danger never receded. The village was full of eyes, neighbors who watched each other, resistance fighters looking for traitors, soldiers conducting random searches. Maria knew one single slip would mean execution, for her, for Ernst, possibly for Zofia. And then came the night that nearly destroyed everything. It was late January. A Polish resistance patrol arrived in the village looking for collaborators. They'd heard rumors that someone was hiding a German. They went from house to house, interrogating families. When they came to Maria's door, she knew she had no choice. She brought Ernst downstairs. He was dressed in Tomasz's clothes, pale, limping, silent. Maria held Zofia and stood beside him, her face a mask of calm. "This is my brother Piotr," she said. "He was injured in the fields. He's recovering here." The resistance men studied him. One of them frowned. "He doesn't look familiar." "He's been away," Maria said. "He came back in the fall. He doesn't get out much." The leader stepped closer. "Speak." Ernst looked up. He said nothing. Maria held her breath. "He doesn't speak anymore," she said quickly. "Trauma. From the war." The silence stretched. The leader looked at Ernst, then at Maria, then at Zofia, quiet in her arms. Finally, he nodded. "If you're lying," he said quietly, "we'll be back." They left. Maria closed the door and collapsed against it, shaking. Ernst looked at her, his eyes full of something she couldn't name. Maybe remorse, maybe reverence. He stayed 3 more weeks. By mid-February, the front shifted again. German forces retreated further west. Ernst knew he had to go. Staying longer would only increase Maria's danger. He thanked her in the only language they shared, the silence of human understanding. She gave him food, a torn map, and watched him disappear into the night. She never knew what happened to him, if he made it home, if he survived the war, if he remembered her, but he changed something in her. Because in the act of saving him, Maria learned something about herself. She learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite it. She learned that humanity doesn't bow to propaganda, that compassion has no nationality, that in the darkest moment, the smallest, most ordinary thing, a woman, a mother, a widow with no power, can defy the entire weight of war. Maria's story was never officially recorded. There were no medals, no recognition, no documents. She never told anyone, not even after the war ended. The fear of retaliation ran too deep. The shame of helping the enemy was too great. She carried the secret in silence, a private lesson in humanity that would never be celebrated. But stories have a way of surviving. Decades later, in 1989, a young German historian named Klaus Becker was researching unpublished war memoirs in Munich. He discovered a diary written by Ernst Müller, a veteran who had died in 1987. In the diary, Ernst described his escape from Soviet lines, his collapse in a Polish village, the young widow who hid him, the child who smiled at him, the lie that saved him. He never knew her name. He only remembered her face. Klaus spent years trying to track down the village. He interviewed survivors, searched church records. Finally, he found an old woman who remembered a Maria Kowalski, a widow who lived alone with her daughter during the war. She had died in 1983. Her daughter, Zofia, was still alive, living in Warsaw. When Klaus contacted her, Zofia wept. She hadn't known. Her mother had never told her, never mentioned the German soldier, never spoken about those terrible January days when death sat in her attic and compassion kept it breathing. Klaus published the story in a small academic journal in 1991. Few people read it, but those who did understood something profound. That war isn't just about armies and borders, it's about choices. Choices made by people with no weapons, no power, no protection. Choices made in doorways, in attics, in whispers after nightfall. Choices that never make it into history books, but that shape the soul of humanity. Maria Kowalski never saw herself as a hero. She saw herself as a mother trying to survive. But in the act of saving an enemy, she became something more. She became proof that even in the deepest darkness, there is light. That even when the world insists we are enemies, we are first and foremost human. Think about it. In 1945, in a forgotten village, a 24-year-old woman looked at an enemy soldier bleeding on her doorstep and chose life over loyalty. She chose risk over safety. She chose compassion over fear. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because she couldn't not do it. And that choice, that single silent decision on a snowy January morning, echoed through the decades. It reached a historian in Munich. It reached a daughter in Warsaw. It reaches you now, sitting wherever you are, reading about a woman you'll never meet, but whose act you'll never forget. Because in the end, that's what history really is. Not battles and treaties, but people. People like Maria. People who did the right thing when no one was watching. People who saved lives with their own empty hands. People who proved that kindness doesn't need rank or weapon or recognition. It only needs a choice. Maria Kowalski made hers on January 3rd, 1945. And though her name is lost to most of the world, her courage remains. A widow, a mother. A woman who protected an enemy soldier by pretending he was her brother. And in doing so, she became sister to all humanity.